The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, burying the settlement under 4 feet of snow, while temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Inside her hillside shelter, Bronwyn Cadwallader sat in comfortable warmth, listening to the muffled howl of wind that couldn't reach her, knowing that by morning those who had mocked her would come seeking refuge in the earth. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more impossible survival innovation from the frontier. The autumn of 1851 brought an unusual sight to the scattered settlement along Sweetwater Creek in Wyoming Territory. While other homesteaders cleared timber and notched logs for winter cabins, Bronwyn Cadwallader spent her days walking the surrounding hillsides with a shovel over her shoulder, studying the earth itself. She would stop at various slopes, dig small test holes, examine the soil composition, then move on to the next location. The behavior struck her neighbors as odd at best, concerning at worst. A woman alone on the frontier needed shelter before the first snow, and September was already giving way to October. Bronwyn was 32 years old that autumn, a widow of 6 months. She had arrived in the territory the previous spring with her husband Owen, full of plans for a new life far from the cold, darkened valleys of Wales. They had claimed a promising piece of land near the creek, started a garden, and begun gathering materials for a cabin. Then, in April, during a late spring storm, Owen had taken shelter in a partially completed trapper's cabin they had found abandoned near their claim. The structure's roof, weakened by winter snow and poor construction, had collapsed during the night. Bronwyn found him the next morning, buried under timber and sod that should have protected him, but instead had killed him. She buried Owen on a rise overlooking their claim and spent the summer in a canvas tent, tending her garden and thinking about shelter. Most widows in her situation would have returned east or sought protection through remarriage. Bronwyn did neither. She had survived too much to give up on the life she and Owen had imagined, and she had learned something from his death that she couldn't ignore. The way people built on the frontier was often fast, but not always safe. Traditional cabins went up quickly, but they failed in predictable ways. Roofs collapsed under snow loads, walls separated at corners during severe storms, fires consumed dried timber, and through the coldest months, even the best-built cabin remained barely warmer than the frozen air outside, requiring constant fires that consumed vast quantities of wood. Bronwyn's father, Defied Evans, had spent 40 years working coal mines in Merthyr Tydfil. He had taught his daughter things most girls never learned, not from any progressive belief in equality, but from practical necessity. His wife had died when Bronwyn was 8, leaving him to raise her alone. So she had accompanied him to the mine works, listened to his explanations of tunnel construction, learned to recognize stable earth from unstable soil, and understood why certain structures stood for generations, while others collapsed without warning. Those lessons, absorbed through childhood and dismissed as irrelevant when she married and moved to America, suddenly seemed like the most valuable knowledge she possessed. Owen Cadwallader had died because he trusted a structure built by someone who didn't understand load distribution. The abandoned trapper's cabin had looked solid enough from the outside, but Bronwyn's father would have seen the fatal flaws immediately. The roof poles were spaced too far apart. The walls weren't properly braced to support the weight of accumulated snow. The entire structure relied on hope rather than engineering, and hope wasn't enough when winter storms tested every weakness. Bronwyn had grown up in a world where understanding earth and stone meant the difference between life and death. The coal mines of South Wales were dangerous places, but the men who worked them weren't reckless. They were careful, methodical, and deeply respectful of the rock above their heads. Her father had explained the principles repeatedly during her childhood visits to the mine works. Rock and earth could bear tremendous weight if shaped properly. An arched ceiling distributed force naturally, spreading the load across the entire curve rather than concentrating stress at specific points. Proper timbering didn't fight against the earth but worked with it, providing support at critical junctures while allowing the natural strength of the surrounding material to do most of the work. She remembered watching miners assess new tunnel routes, examining the soil and rock composition, testing for water seepage, checking for instability. They didn't just dig randomly. They planned, measured, and adjusted their approach based on what the earth told them. A coal seam might run through 3 different types of rock, each requiring different support techniques. Clay soil compressed differently than sandy soil. Wet earth behaved differently than dry. Understanding these differences wasn't academic knowledge. It was survival information passed from experienced miners to apprentices through demonstration and careful explanation. Defied had taught Bronwyn to read earth the way others read books. She learned to recognize the feel of stable clay versus crumbling shale. She understood why certain hillsides held firm while others slumped and slid during heavy rain. She knew that earth maintained a constant temperature below the frost line, staying cool in summer and warm in winter compared to surface air. The mines were always the same temperature regardless of season, a fact every miner understood, but few people outside that world considered significant. When Owen died under a collapsed roof, Bronwyn's grief was sharp and immediate, but so was her anger. The structure that killed him had been built wrong. Someone had constructed it without understanding basic principles of weight and support. And as she looked at the traditional cabin building happening around her in Wyoming Territory, she saw the same lack of understanding everywhere. People built cabins the way they had always been built, using methods passed down through generations, never questioning whether those methods were actually the best approach for surviving in harsh conditions. She could build differently. She could apply her father's mining knowledge to the problem of frontier shelter. The question wasn't whether it would work. The question was whether she had the courage to do something everyone else would consider insane. Bronwyn selected her site in mid-October after 3 weeks of careful evaluation. The hillside she chose faced south, ensuring maximum sun exposure during winter months. The slope was gentle enough to work safely, but steep enough to provide good drainage. Most importantly, when she dug her test holes, she found exactly what she needed at 18 inches below the surface. Dense clay soil, slightly moist but not waterlogged, with almost no rocks or roots. Clay was perfect for her purposes. It held its shape when carved, compressed tightly under weight, and provided excellent insulation. The location sat 200 yards from Sweetwater Creek, higher than any probable flood level, with clear sight lines in 3 directions. The hillside itself was covered in prairie grass and scattered sagebrush, with a few juniper trees marking the ridgeline above. To anyone passing by, it looked like unremarkable terrain. That was exactly what Bronwyn wanted. Visibility from a distance meant nothing if the structure itself blended into the landscape. She began excavation on October 18, 1851. The work was physically demanding but not complicated. She started by marking the entrance location with wooden stakes, then began removing earth in controlled layers. Her approach differed completely from standard digging. Most people excavating for a root cellar or foundation simply removed dirt as quickly as possible, creating a rough hole that would later require extensive shoring and support. Bronwyn worked like a miner, carefully shaping each cut, maintaining specific angles, and constantly assessing the stability of the earth around her. The entrance tunnel was critical. She excavated it at a slight downward angle, heading into the hillside at 5 degrees below horizontal. This slope would allow cold air to drain naturally away from the main living chamber while preventing rain or snowmelt from flowing inward. The tunnel was 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, large enough to move through comfortably but small enough to retain structural integrity without timber supports. She carved the ceiling in a gentle arch. The shape her father had taught her was strongest. As she worked, neighbors began to notice. The first was Ewan Davies, a loud man from Cornwall who had established a claim half a mile downstream. He rode past on his mule one afternoon, stopped, and stared at Bronwyn standing waist-deep in a hole in the ground, covered in clay dust. "What in God's name are you doing, woman?" he called out. Bronwyn looked up, leaning on her shovel. "Building my home, Mr. Davies." He laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. "That's not a home. That's a grave you're digging." He shook his head and rode on, still chuckling. Others came by over the following days, offering similar observations. Some were concerned, suggesting she didn't understand how frontier construction worked. Some were condescending, explaining that cabins were built from logs, not dug from earth. Bronwyn's tool collection was simple but sufficient. She owned 2 shovels, one with a pointed blade for breaking ground, and another with a flat blade for moving loose soil. She had a mattock for cutting through roots and breaking up compacted earth. A handsaw and hatchet served for the minimal timber work she would need. Most importantly, she had brought from Wales a coal miner's smoothing tool, a flat iron blade mounted on a long handle designed for finishing tunnel walls to prevent loose material from falling. Her father had given it to her as a wedding present, never imagining she would use it for its intended purpose. The excavation process followed a rhythm. Each morning she worked for 3 hours, removing earth and shaping the tunnel walls. Midday she rested, ate a simple meal, and let her muscles recover. Afternoons brought another 3 hours of work, followed by evening chores, tending her small garden and preparing food. The dirt she removed was piled systematically on the downslope side of the entrance, where it wouldn't interfere with drainage and could later be used for other purposes. By early November, the entrance tunnel extended 12 feet into the hillside. The walls were smooth and nearly vertical, the ceiling a perfect arch. The floor was level and hard-packed. The structure needed no timber supports because the arch shape and dense clay composition made it self-supporting. Bronwyn knew from her father's teaching that this tunnel could remain open for decades without collapsing, as long as water was managed properly. The mockery intensified as her work continued. Maddock Bevan, who served as the informal leader of the scattered settlement, stopped by with what he clearly considered helpful advice. "Mrs. Cadwallader, winter's coming fast. You need proper shelter. My boys and I can help you raise a cabin in 4 days. No charge, just Christian charity." Bronwyn thanked him politely but declined. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Bevan, but I'm quite capable of finishing my own home." He looked at the hole in the hillside, then back at her. "Ma'am, that's not a home. That's desperation. You'll freeze to death in there come January." The women of the settlement were less direct but equally dismissive. Caris Hughes, whose family had a claim 3 miles north, visited one afternoon with what she called a welfare check. She brought bread and preserves, kind gestures that barely concealed her real purpose. "Bronwyn, dear, we're all worried about you. Living alone, doing this strange digging, it's not natural. A woman needs proper shelter and proper company." Bronwyn accepted the food with genuine gratitude, but refused the implicit suggestion that she abandon her project. "I know it looks unusual, Caris, but I promise you, I know what I'm doing." Caris left, shaking her head, convinced Bronwyn's grief had affected her judgment. The children were most honest. They rode by on ponies shouting, "Badger Woman!" and "Mole Lady," before galloping away laughing. The science behind Bronwyn's construction was straightforward, though few people on the frontier understood it. Earth, when properly shaped and supported, was one of the strongest building materials available. The key was working with its natural properties rather than fighting against them. Her father had explained this principle using a simple demonstration when she was 12 years old. He had taken a raw egg and shown her that pressing on the ends, where the shell formed a dome, required significant force to break it, but pressing on the side, where the curve was interrupted, shattered it easily. "Structure is everything," he had told her. "Shape determines strength." The hillside Bronwyn had selected offered ideal composition for her purposes. The clay content was high, probably 60%, with the remainder being silt and fine sand. This mixture had enough clay to hold its shape when carved, but enough sand to prevent excessive expansion and contraction with moisture changes. Pure clay would crack as it dried. Pure sand would crumble and collapse. The natural mixture provided stability. She tested this by carving small samples and letting them dry, observing how they held their form without significant cracking or degradation. Water management was critical. Her father's mine had faced constant challenges with groundwater seepage, and the techniques developed to handle that problem applied directly to her shelter construction. She observed the hillside during and after rainstorms, noting how water flowed across the surface and where it penetrated the soil. The entrance location she had chosen sat on a slight rise, with natural drainage channels on both sides that carried runoff downhill. She enhanced these channels by digging shallow trenches that intercepted water before it could reach her entrance. The downward slope of her entrance tunnel meant that even if water did enter, it would flow back out rather than pooling inside. The arched ceiling design was perhaps the most important structural element. When earth above a tunnel presses down, the force travels through the arch shape and redirects outward to the sides, where it's absorbed by the surrounding earth. This is why stone bridges and ancient Roman aqueducts used arches. The shape converts downward pressure into outward pressure, and as long as the sides are stable, the structure can support tremendous weight. Bronwyn carved her tunnel ceiling in a smooth, consistent curve, using the miner's smoothing tool to create a surface free of irregularities that might concentrate stress. She calculated the arch proportions using knowledge her father had shared about safe mining tunnel dimensions. For a 6-foot-wide tunnel, the arch should rise approximately 3 feet from the spring line, where the curve begins. This created a semicircular profile that distributed weight optimally. The walls from floor to spring line remained vertical, providing usable space while maintaining structural integrity. The total interior height of 7 feet allowed comfortable movement while keeping the earth above the tunnel thick enough to provide insulation and stability. Temperature regulation was another principle Bronwyn understood from mining experience. Below the frost line, approximately 4 feet deep in Wyoming Territory, the earth maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. By mid-November, Bronwyn had excavated 20 feet into the hillside, and the tunnel had begun its transformation into a living chamber. The entrance tunnel continued for 12 feet at its original 6-foot width, then opened into a larger space that would serve as her main room. This chamber measured 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep, with the same arched ceiling design carried through on a larger scale. The expanded width required a taller arch to maintain proper proportions, so the ceiling rose to 9 feet at its highest point, creating a spacious interior that felt nothing like the cramped hole her neighbors imagined. The excavation of the main chamber required different techniques than the entrance tunnel. Bronwyn worked systematically, removing earth in horizontal layers rather than digging straight back. She started at the top, carving the arch shape into the clay, then worked downward in controlled stages. This approach prevented destabilizing the earth above and allowed her to maintain the precise curve necessary for structural integrity. Each day's work removed approximately 6 inches of depth across the entire chamber width. The process was slow, but the results were exactly what she needed. The clay's natural adhesion helped considerably. Unlike sandy or gravelly soil that would crumble and require immediate timber supports, the dense clay held its shape as she carved. The smooth wall she created with her finishing tool actually hardened slightly when exposed to air, forming a surface that resisted erosion and shedding. This was the same principle that allowed coal mine tunnels to remain open for years with minimal support. The earth, when shaped properly and kept dry, was perfectly capable of supporting itself. Bronwyn paid careful attention to the floor elevation as the chamber took shape. She carved it at a level 18 inches higher than the entrance tunnel floor, creating a step up from the entrance. This elevation difference served multiple purposes. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would settle in the lower entrance tunnel rather than flowing into the main living space. The step also prevented any water that might enter the tunnel from reaching the living area. And psychologically, stepping up into the main chamber created a sense of entering a proper room rather than descending into a hole. The walls of the main chamber weren't perfectly vertical like the entrance tunnel. Instead, Bronwyn carved them with a slight inward angle, perhaps 5 degrees from true vertical. This subtle slope added to the overall structural stability by directing the earth's weight inward and downward, where the arched ceiling could distribute it properly. The technique was common in mine shaft construction, where stability mattered more than maximizing interior space. She sacrificed perhaps 10 inches of width to gain significantly improved structural integrity. As the chamber neared completion, visitors continued their critical observations. Ewan Davies rode by one cold afternoon, saw the growing pile of excavated earth, and called out mockingly, "Still digging your way to hell, Mrs. Cadwallader?" Bronwyn straightened from her work, clay-covered and tired. The entrance structure required the only significant timber work in Bronwyn's entire construction. While the earth tunnel itself needed no wooden supports, the exterior opening where the tunnel met the hillside surface required reinforcement to prevent erosion and provide a proper door frame. She had salvaged timber from the collapsed cabin where Owen died, choosing pieces carefully for this purpose. The irony of using wood from a failed structure to reinforce her successful one was not lost on her, but waste was inexcusable on the frontier, and the timber was sound despite the cabin's poor overall design. She constructed a rectangular frame using 4 heavy posts, each 8 inches square and 10 feet long. 2 posts were set vertically on either side of the tunnel entrance, buried 3 feet deep and anchored with rocks and tamped earth. 2 horizontal beams connected the verticals at top and bottom, creating a door frame 7 feet high and 4 feet wide. The frame was deliberately smaller than the tunnel opening behind it, leaving thick earth walls extending 2 feet on either side and above. This design meant the wooden frame supported only the door itself, not the weight of the hillside above. The earth carried its own weight through the arch structure. Sealing the gaps between timber and earth was critical. Bronwyn used a mixture she had prepared weeks earlier, combining clay from her excavation with cut prairie grass and water. The grass fibers reinforced the clay, preventing cracks as it dried, while the clay's natural adhesion bonded it to both wood and earth. She packed this mixture into every gap around the doorframe, smoothing it carefully to create a continuous seal. The result looked primitive, but was functionally superior to many cabin constructions she had observed, where gaps between logs allowed wind and cold to penetrate freely. The door itself was built from planks she had shaped using Owen's tools. Each plank was 3 inches thick, cut from seasoned pine she had purchased from a sawmill in Fort Laramie during the summer. She had spent precious money on this timber, knowing the door would be critical to her shelter's functionality. The planks were fitted edge to edge and reinforced on the interior side with 3 horizontal cross braces and 2 diagonal braces forming an X pattern. Heavy iron hinges, also purchased in Fort Laramie, mounted to both the door and the frame using bolts rather than nails. The door was heavy, requiring both hands to swing it open, but that weight meant it seated firmly when closed and wouldn't rattle in wind. She hung the door to swing inward, which seemed counterintuitive to some observers, but made perfect sense for her purposes. An inward swinging door couldn't be forced open by wind or snow accumulation on the exterior. It also meant the door, when opened, didn't block access to the tunnel. A simple wooden bar on the interior, dropping into iron brackets mounted to the frame, provided secure locking. drainage around the entrance required equal attention. With the main chamber excavated and the entrance secured, Bronwyn turned her attention to the interior features that would make the space genuinely habitable. The raw earth room, while structurally sound and well insulated, needed specific elements to function as a home rather than simply a cave. She approached this phase with the same methodical planning that had characterized her excavation work, designing each feature to serve multiple purposes while maintaining the structural integrity of the surrounding earth. The sleeping platform was her first priority. Rather than building a freestanding bed that would occupy floor space and require lumber, she carved a raised platform directly into the earth along the chamber's back wall. The platform measured 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, elevated 2 feet above the main floor. She excavated the surrounding floor area while leaving the platform intact, essentially carving the room around the bed rather than adding furniture afterward. This approach used no materials and created storage space beneath the platform where she could keep supplies protected from any moisture that might affect the floor level. The platform's surface required treatment to make it suitable for sleeping. Bronwyn used her smoothing tool to create a flat, even surface, then applied a coating of clay mixed with ash from her cooking fires. The ash raised the clay's pH and helped it cure harder and more water-resistant. After the coating dried for 3 days, she covered the platform with a layer of dried prairie grass, then canvas cloth, then wool blankets. The result was a sleeping surface that was firm, dry, and surprisingly comfortable. The surrounding earth acted as a massive heat sink, moderating temperature fluctuations and maintaining the constant cool temperature that characterized underground spaces. Storage alcoves were carved into the walls at various heights. Bronwyn created 5 distinct alcoves, each approximately 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, positioned to avoid compromising the wall's structural integrity. These alcoves were placed in the vertical sections of the walls below the spring line of the arch, where excavating them wouldn't affect the ceiling's load-bearing capacity. She smoothed the interior surfaces of each alcove and treated them with the same ash-clay mixture used on the sleeping platform. These recesses provided convenient storage for clothing, tools, food supplies, and personal items without cluttering the floor space. The fireplace required the most complex design work. Bronwyn couldn't simply build a fire on the earthen floor without creating smoke problems and potential structural damage. She needed a proper firebox with adequate draft and a chimney that would vent smoke to the surface without allowing cold air to pour down into the living space. The solution drew again from her father's mining knowledge. Mines required ventilation shafts to provide fresh air and remove dangerous gases. The same principle would work for her fireplace chimney, but the design had to account for the specific challenge of preventing downdrafts. She carved the firebox into the left wall of the chamber, creating a recess 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 4 feet high. The storage system Bronwyn designed reflected her understanding that successful frontier living required organization and planning. She had observed too many cabins where supplies were piled haphazardly, making it difficult to locate items and leading to waste when food spoiled or tools were misplaced. Her underground shelter's design allowed for integrated storage that would keep supplies accessible, protected, and properly organized through the long winter months ahead. The primary shelving structure occupied the right wall of the main chamber, opposite the fireplace. Bronwyn had left this wall completely smooth during excavations specifically for this purpose. Now she constructed a wooden framework that would mount directly to the earth surface. The framework consisted of vertical posts made from straight pine branches she had cut and stripped, each approximately 4 inches in diameter. She carved shallow recesses into the earth wall, set the posts into these recesses, then packed them firmly with clay mixture. The posts extended from floor to the spring line of the arch, approximately 6 feet of vertical space. Horizontal shelves spanned between the vertical posts at intervals of 14 inches, creating 5 shelf levels. The shelves themselves were made from split logs, flattened on the top surface to create level storage areas. Each shelf was approximately 18 inches deep and extended the full 8-foot length of the designated wall section. Bronwyn secured them to the vertical posts using wooden pegs rather than nails, which allowed for future adjustment if needed and avoided the expense of metal hardware. The entire structure was robust enough to hold significant weight, but used minimal materials. She organized her supplies systematically across the 5 shelf levels. The bottom shelf, easiest to access from floor level, held items needed daily: cooking utensils, eating implements, basic tools. The second shelf contained food supplies for immediate use: dried meat, hardtack, cornmeal, salt, coffee. The third shelf stored preserved foods in clay crocks and glass jars, pickled vegetables, fruit preserves, rendered fat, honey. The fourth shelf held medical supplies, sewing materials, and personal items. The top shelf, requiring a stool to reach comfortably, stored reserve supplies and items needed infrequently. Additional storage occupied the space beneath the sleeping platform. Bronwyn kept her trunk of clothing there, along with Owen's tools, spare blankets, and a small barrel of flour. The elevated platform protected these items from any moisture that might affect the floor, while keeping them readily accessible. She also stored firewood in this area, stacking it neatly to allow air circulation that would keep it dry despite the underground environment. The food storage capacity was substantial. Bronwyn had spent the summer and autumn preparing preserved food specifically for winter isolation. She had dried venison and elk, pickled wild onions and prairie turnips, preserved choke cherries and buffalo berries in honey, and collected wild rose hips for tea. Clay crocks held rendered bear fat and tallow. She had purchased 50 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of coffee, and 20 pounds of salt during her summer trip to Fort Laramie. The door Bronwyn had constructed was functional, but as November progressed and temperatures began dropping, she recognized the need for additional weatherproofing beyond basic timber construction. A simple wooden door, no matter how well built, would allow cold air to seep through gaps and cracks. The entrance tunnel itself provided some insulation by creating distance between the exterior and the main living chamber, but she could improve the system significantly with careful attention to sealing and thermal barriers. She started by addressing the gaps around the door's perimeter. Even with careful carpentry, slight irregularities between the door edge and the frame allowed air movement. Bronwyn cut strips of wool cloth from an old blanket, tacking them to the door frame so they compressed against the door when it closed. This created a soft seal that blocked airflow while still allowing the door to open and close smoothly. She paid particular attention to the bottom edge, where the gap was largest, doubling the wool strips and ensuring they dragged slightly against the door's lower edge. The door's interior surface received additional insulation treatment. Bronwyn had saved several deer hides from animals she had hunted during autumn. She scraped these hides clean, treated them with tallow to maintain flexibility, then tacked them to the interior face of the door with the fur side facing inward. The hide layer added both insulation value and additional air sealing. The fur created dead air space that resisted heat transfer, while the hide itself blocked wind infiltration. The result was a door that was substantially warmer to the touch from the interior and noticeably reduced cold air penetration. Beyond the door itself, Bronwyn created an additional thermal barrier using a heavy canvas curtain. She mounted a wooden rod across the tunnel entrance just inside the main chamber, about 6 feet from the door. From this rod she hung canvas cloth that extended from ceiling to floor, overlapping by several inches on both sides. This curtain created an airlock effect. When she entered or exited through the exterior door, cold air that rushed in would be trapped in the entrance tunnel, stopped by the canvas barrier before it could reach the living space. The canvas could be tied back during warmer weather, but would remain closed throughout winter. The locking mechanism remained simple but effective. The wooden bar that dropped into iron brackets provided security against intrusion, though the remote location made such concerns minimal. More importantly, the bar helped seal the door tightly closed by pulling it firmly against the frame and compressing the wool strips. Bronwyn had positioned the brackets so the bar required slight force to seat properly, ensuring the door couldn't rattle loose in heavy wind. She tested the complete door system during a cold snap in late November when temperatures dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. With the door closed, the canvas curtain in place, and a small fire burning in the firebox, the main chamber maintained a comfortable temperature in the mid-60s. On November 23, 1851, Bronwyn Cadwallader moved her remaining possessions from the canvas tent she had occupied since spring into her completed underground shelter. The move was simple, requiring only 3 trips to carry her trunk, bedding, and final supplies the 200 yards from tent to hillside entrance. As she made the last trip carrying her few books and Owen's pocket watch wrapped carefully in cloth, light snow began falling. The timing felt appropriate, as though nature itself was acknowledging the completion of her work and the beginning of winter's test. The shelter's interior had been transformed over the past week. The sleeping platform held her mattress, stuffed with prairie grass and covered with wool blankets, and the quilt she had brought from Wales. The shelves were fully stocked with preserved foods, tools, and supplies, organized for easy access through the dark months ahead. The fireplace drew perfectly, venting smoke through the chimney she had constructed while pulling fresh air from the entrance tunnel. Oil lamps hung from wooden pegs driven into the walls, their soft light reflecting off the smooth clay surfaces. The space was comfortable, dry, and surprisingly warm despite no fire currently burning. She had invited no one to see the finished work. The construction had been solitary, and the occupation would be equally private. Bronwyn had no desire to prove anything to her neighbors through tours or demonstrations. The shelter would prove itself through winter, and those who had mocked her would see the results when spring arrived. For now, she was content to settle into the space she had created, testing its systems and adjusting to underground living. The first night in her new home revealed characteristics she had anticipated, but not fully experienced until living within the space. The silence was profound. Earth was an excellent sound insulator, blocking wind noise, animal sounds, and the general ambient noise of the prairie night. When she extinguished the lamps and lay in darkness, the quiet was almost disorienting. She could hear her own breathing, the settling of the fire's coals. Nothing else. It took several nights to adjust to this deep silence, but eventually she found it restful rather than unnerving. The temperature stability was equally striking. Outside, November temperatures swung from mid-40s during sunny afternoons to below 20 at night. Inside her shelter, the temperature varied by perhaps 3 degrees over the course of a day, hovering consistently around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. This was exactly what she had expected based on her father's descriptions of mine shaft temperatures, but experiencing it was different from knowing it intellectually. When she lit even a small fire for cooking, the interior temperature rose quickly to the mid-60s and held there for hours after the fire died. The settlement's reaction to her move underground was swift and predictable. Ewan Davies, who apparently made it his business to monitor her activities, noticed smoke rising from what appeared to be bare hillside on her second day of occupation. He rode over to investigate, found the disguised chimney vent, then located the entrance below. He stood outside, shaking his head in obvious disbelief. Mid-November brought the first serious cold to Wyoming Territory. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of November 15th, accompanied by wind that drove the perceived temperature far lower. Bronwyn woke that morning in her underground shelter to complete comfort. The interior temperature, having dropped only to 50 degrees overnight, despite no fire burning since the previous evening. She lit a small fire for cooking breakfast, and within 20 minutes the living chamber had warmed to 68 degrees. The fire required perhaps 1/8 the wood a surface cabin would have consumed to achieve the same warmth. The contrast with surface conditions became apparent when Karis Hughes visited that afternoon. Karis arrived bundled in multiple layers of wool, her face red from cold and wind exposure during the 3-mile ride from her family's cabin. When Bronwyn invited her inside, Karis descended the entrance tunnel hesitantly, clearly uncertain what to expect. Her expression changed to obvious surprise when she entered the main chamber. "It's warm," she said, stating the obvious because the reality contradicted everything she had expected. "How is it warm with barely any fire?" Bronwyn explained the basic principle while pouring tea from the pot that sat near the fire. "The earth stays the same temperature all year round once you get below the frost line. Out here that's about 50 degrees, so the walls, floor, and ceiling are all naturally that temperature. A small fire adds just enough heat to make it comfortable, and the earth holds that warmth instead of letting it escape like cabin walls do." Karis looked around the chamber, taking in the organized shelves, the comfortable sleeping platform, the functional fireplace. "How much wood do you use in a day?" she asked. Bronwyn gestured toward a small stack near the fireplace. "About that much, perhaps 6 or 7 pieces for cooking and a bit of extra warmth in the evening." Karis's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex, a mixture of realization and discomfort. "We go through half a cord every 3 days just to keep from freezing," she said quietly. "Maddock and the boys spend half their time cutting and hauling wood. We're already worried about whether we have enough to last until spring." She looked at Bronwyn's modest wood supply, then back at the comfortable interior. "You were right. We were all wrong." But Karis didn't spread this realization through the settlement. Social pressure worked in complex ways, and admitting that Bronwyn's unconventional approach was superior would have required acknowledging that the entire community had been foolish in their mockery. It was easier to say nothing, to return home and continue with traditional methods while privately recognizing their inadequacy. Bronwyn understood this and didn't press the point. Truth would reveal itself regardless of who acknowledged it verbally. The weather pattern continued through late November and into December. Temperatures remained consistently cold, ranging from single digits at night to the low 20s during the day. Bronwyn's routine settled into comfortable predictability. She rose each morning, lit a fire for breakfast, tended the fire minimally throughout the day, and allowed it to die down overnight. December 1851 was unusually cold, even by Wyoming Territory standards. Temperatures stayed below freezing throughout the month, with nighttime lows frequently reaching 15 below zero. Snow fell intermittently, accumulating to 18 inches on level ground by mid-month. The creek froze solid. Wildlife became scarce as animals sought whatever shelter they could find. For settlers living in log cabins, the month was a grinding test of endurance, characterized by constant fire tending, diminishing wood supplies, and the creeping cold that penetrated every gap and crack in timber construction. Bronwyn's experience was dramatically different. She ventured outside daily for necessary tasks, collecting snow to melt for water, checking on the 2 chickens she kept in a small coop built against the hillside near her entrance, and occasionally hunting when weather permitted. But these excursions were brief. The majority of her time was spent in the comfortable stability of her underground home, where temperature remained constant regardless of surface conditions. She read Owen's books by lamplight, mended clothing, prepared meals, and maintained her living space. The isolation was complete, but not unpleasant. She had chosen this life deliberately and was content with the choice. The settlement's silence toward her was equally complete. No one visited after Karis's November trip. No one sent greetings or checked on her welfare. The social isolation that had begun with mockery during construction had evolved into something more complicated. The other settlers were discovering that Bronwyn had been correct in her unconventional approach, but acknowledging this fact would have required admitting their own error. It was easier to ignore her existence entirely, to pretend the woman in the hillside wasn't demonstrating a superior survival method while they struggled with inferior traditional construction. Bronwyn was aware of their difficulties through indirect observation. When she did encounter neighbors during brief trips to check her trap lines or hunt, their appearance told the story. They looked exhausted, worn down by the constant labor of keeping warm. Their wood supplies were visibly diminishing. Some cabins showed damage from the harsh conditions, with gaps opening between logs as the wood dried and contracted in the extreme cold. She offered no comments and no assistance beyond basic courtesy. They had made their choices. She had made hers. Her own supply situation was excellent. The food stored on her shelves was more than adequate for winter. The cool, stable temperature of the shelter was ideal for preservation, keeping dried meat and vegetables fresh while preventing the freezing that could damage preserved goods in unheated storage areas. Her wood consumption remained minimal. The small stack she had gathered in October was barely diminished by month's end. At her current usage rate, she could maintain comfortable warmth through the entire winter with less wood than her neighbors burned in a single week. The psychological comfort of her shelter extended beyond physical warmth. The underground space felt secure in a way surface structures did not. When wind howled across the prairie, she heard only a distant murmur. The storm arrived on January 7, 1852, without significant warning. The morning dawned cold and still, with temperatures around zero and a flat gray sky that suggested snow, but gave no indication of severity. Bronwyn had seen enough frontier winters to recognize the particular quality of light that preceded major storms. She spent the morning bringing extra snow inside to melt for water, checking her wood supply, and ensuring the chimney vent was clear. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl, and visibility had dropped to nothing. The blizzard was the worst storm to hit the region in a decade. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie and creating drifts that buried anything in their path. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero, a lethal cold made more dangerous by wind that stripped away any possibility of retaining body heat in exposed conditions. The storm lasted 3 full days without pause, dumping 4 feet of snow on level ground and creating drifts 10 feet deep in sheltered areas. Inside her underground shelter, Bronwyn was completely protected. The entrance tunnel collected some drifting snow, but the downward angle prevented deep accumulation and the door remained accessible. The wind, despite its surface fury, didn't penetrate the earth. The temperature in her living chamber remained at its constant 50 degrees, requiring only her usual small fire to maintain comfortable warmth. She could hear the storm as a distant rumble, like thunder heard from far away, but the sound was muted and non-threatening. She spent the 3 days reading, doing handwork, and occasionally wondering how her neighbors were faring. The settlers in surface cabins were fighting for survival. The extreme cold defeated even the largest fires. Gaps between logs that had seemed minor in moderate weather became deadly vulnerabilities when wind-driven cold penetrated every crack. Snow accumulated on roofs, adding weight that stressed corner joints and roof structures. Some families huddled together in single rooms, burning furniture when firewood ran low, wrapped in every available blanket and still shivering. Others attempted to reach neighbors for help or additional supplies, only to be driven back by conditions that made travel impossible and exposure fatal within minutes. Ewan Davies's cabin suffered structural damage on the second night of the storm. A roof support beam, weakened by previous snow loads and stressed by the mounting weight of fresh accumulation, cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The roof sagged but didn't collapse completely. Davies and his wife spent the remainder of the storm propping up the damaged section with furniture while snow sifted through the opening, creating a growing pile in the corner of their single room. The temperature inside dropped below freezing, despite a roaring fire that consumed their remaining firewood at an alarming rate. Maddox Bevan's family faced equally desperate circumstances. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 10th. The wind died, the snow stopped falling, and pale sunlight revealed a transformed landscape. Drifts had reshaped the familiar terrain into an alien geography of white hills and valleys. The creek was buried under snow, trees bent under accumulated weight. The scattered cabins of the settlement were half buried, with snow piled against walls and covering roofs in thick blankets that obscured original structures beneath layers of white. Bronwyn emerged from her shelter that morning to find her entrance tunnel partially filled with drifted snow, but the accumulation was loose and easily removed with her shovel. She cleared the drift in 20 minutes, creating a path to the surface. The hillside above her shelter showed no indication of the home beneath. Without knowing exactly where to look, a person could walk past within 10 feet and see nothing but snow-covered prairie. She climbed to the top of the rise and looked across the settlement area, assessing the visible damage from distance. Smoke rose from most cabin chimneys, indicating survivors, but the amount of smoke suggested desperate attempts to generate warmth with whatever fuel remained. She could see Ewan Davies's cabin even from 200 yards away, the roof sag, visible as a distinct depression in the snow layer covering it. Other structures showed similar stress, though none had collapsed completely. But the real damage wasn't visible from outside. The real damage was measured in depleted resources, physical exhaustion, and the creeping realization that January was typically the coldest month, and winter would continue for at least 2 more months. That afternoon, Maddox Bevan's eldest son appeared at Bronwyn's entrance, stumbling through waist-deep snow, his face pale with cold, and something beyond cold. "Mrs. Cadwallader," he called out, his voice hoarse. "My father sent me. We need help. My little sister, her feet are black. Ma says it's frostbite. We can't get her warm. We've burned everything we can burn, and the cabin's still freezing." Bronwyn didn't hesitate. She told the boy to return home and tell his father she would come within the hour. She gathered supplies, wool blankets, dried herbs she knew had some medicinal value, rendered fat that could protect damaged skin, and a clay jug of warm tea from her fire. She dressed in her warmest clothing and made the difficult journey to the Bevan cabin, struggling through drifts that in places reached above her waist. The interior of the Bevan cabin was shockingly cold. Despite a fire burning in the stone fireplace, the temperature inside couldn't have been much above 20 degrees. Gaps between logs showed daylight. The family was huddled together near the fire, wrapped in inadequate blankets, their breath visible in the frigid air. The little girl, perhaps 6 years old, lay with her feet wrapped in cloth, whimpering softly. When Bronwyn unwrapped the cloth, she saw toes that were indeed blackened from frostbite, though whether the damage was permanent would depend on treatment and time. Bronwyn assessed the situation quickly. The child needed warmth immediately, sustained warmth that this cabin could not provide. The family had burned through their winter wood supply during the 3-day storm, leaving them with perhaps 2 days of fuel remaining if they rationed carefully. But careful rationing meant continued exposure to dangerous cold, and the child's condition would worsen rather than improve. The decision was obvious. "You need to come to my shelter," she said to Maddox Bevan. "All of you, right now." Bevan's pride warred visibly with his desperation. He had been among those who mocked Bronwyn's construction most openly. Accepting her help meant acknowledging his error and her success. But his daughter's blackened toes and his wife's pleading expression decided the matter. "We'd be grateful," he said quietly, "just until the child's better. We don't want to impose." The move took 2 hours. Bevan, his wife, his 3 children and Bronwyn, made multiple trips through the snow, carrying blankets, what little food the family had remaining, and personal necessities. When they descended into Bronwyn's entrance tunnel and entered the main chamber, the family's reaction was identical to what Karis Hughes had shown weeks earlier, but intensified by their desperate circumstances. The warmth enveloped them immediately. The children stopped shivering within minutes. The mother began crying, though whether from relief or shame or simple overwhelming emotion was unclear. Bronwyn organized the space efficiently. The family would sleep on the floor near the fireplace, where radiant heat would keep them most comfortable. She gave them her spare blankets and built up the fire slightly to raise the temperature a few degrees above her normal preference. She prepared a meal from her supplies, offering it without comment or expectation of gratitude. The child with frostbite was positioned closest to the fire, her feet elevated and wrapped in clean cloth coated with rendered fat to protect the damaged tissue. Over the next 3 days, other families arrived seeking temporary refuge. Word had spread through the settlement that Bronwyn's underground shelter was warm and that she was willing to share the space. They came in small groups, embarrassed but desperate, carrying their cold children and their depleted supplies. Bronwyn accommodated them as space allowed. The main chamber that had seemed spacious for one person became crowded with 8, then 12, then 15 people, seeking warmth and safety that their own cabins could not provide. The shelter's capacity was tested, but proved adequate. The Earth's thermal mass maintained baseline temperature regardless of occupancy. The additional body heat from multiple people actually reduced the need for fire. Bronwyn's food supplies were strained but sufficient for short-term sharing. The social dynamics were complex and often uncomfortable. These were people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and then ignored her for months. Now they occupied her home, ate her food, and enjoyed the warmth her engineering had created. The blizzard's aftermath lingered through late January and into February. Families returned to their damaged cabins once the immediate crisis passed, but the experience had fundamentally changed the settlement's attitude toward Bronwyn and her unconventional construction. The mockery that had characterized the autumn was replaced by quiet acknowledgement and, eventually, direct questions about how she had built her shelter and whether the technique could be replicated. Maddox Bevan was the first to ask directly. He appeared at her entrance in mid-February, carrying a haunch of venison as payment for the refuge she had provided his family. "My daughter's feet are healing," he said, handing over the meat. "The blackness is fading. The doctor in Fort Laramie says she'll likely keep all her toes, though 2 might be shortened. If we'd stayed in our cabin another day, she would have lost them for certain." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I was wrong about your shelter. We were all wrong. I'd like to understand how you built it, if you're willing to teach me." Bronwyn accepted the venison and invited him inside. Over the next hour, she explained the principles her father had taught her. She described soil selection, the importance of the arched ceiling, drainage management, and thermal mass. She showed him how she had shaped the entrance tunnel, carved the living chamber, and constructed the fireplace with its proper draft. Bevan listened carefully, asking intelligent questions about measurements, angles, and techniques. When he left, he carried knowledge that would change how he approached shelter construction. Others came with similar requests over the following weeks. Some were genuinely interested in understanding the engineering principles. Others simply wanted to copy what had worked, even if they didn't fully comprehend why it worked. Bronwyn shared her knowledge freely with everyone who asked. She had no desire to keep secrets or maintain exclusive expertise. If her technique could help others survive more safely and comfortably, that benefit justified sharing everything she knew. Ewan Davies came last, in early March, when the worst of winter had passed, but cold weather still dominated. His cabin's damaged roof had been temporarily repaired, but he knew the structure was compromised and would need to be replaced or extensively rebuilt before the next winter. "I called you a badger woman," he said without preamble. "Said you were digging your own grave. I was a fool, and I'm man enough to admit it. Would you be willing to look at my land and tell me if there's a good spot for building something like your shelter?" Bronwyn rode with him to his claim that afternoon. She examined the terrain, tested soil in several locations, and identified a hillside that would work well for underground construction. She explained what he would need to do, warned him about common mistakes, and offered to check his work periodically if he wanted guidance. Davies thanked her with awkward sincerity, then asked the question that was clearly weighing on him. "Why are you helping me after how I treated you?" She considered her answer carefully before responding. By the spring of 1855, 7 earth-sheltered homes existed in the scattered settlements along Sweetwater Creek and its tributaries. Each was unique in specific details, but shared the fundamental principles Bronwyn had introduced. Careful site selection in well-drained hillsides, arched earthen ceilings that required no timber support, proper ventilation and drainage systems, and thermal mass that maintained stable interior temperatures year-round. The technique had spread organically as people who had survived in Bronwyn's shelter during the blizzard built their own versions, and as neighbors observed the superior performance of earth-sheltered construction compared to traditional log cabins. Bronwyn's shelter became a regional landmark. Travelers occasionally stopped to see the woman who lived underground, curious about construction that seemed impossible until they descended into the comfortable warmth of her main chamber. She welcomed visitors politely but briefly, having no desire for fame. The shelter was simply her home, built using knowledge her father had given her, applied to solve a practical problem. She never remarried, though she received proposals over the years. Her independence suited her temperament, and Owen's memory remained too present. She expanded her shelter modestly in 1857, excavating a second chamber for storage. She kept chickens, maintained a garden, and trapped enough to trade for supplies. The life was solitary but complete. In 1863, her niece Gwyneth arrived from Wales, orphaned when Bronwyn's brother died in a mine collapse. Bronwyn took her in, teaching her the same skills Dafydd Evans had taught his daughter. How to read earth and stone, how to understand structural principles, how to build with intelligence rather than tradition. Gwyneth eventually built her own earth shelter 3 miles north when she married a surveyor. The technique spread beyond the region. Settlers moving through Wyoming Territory heard about the underground homes and carried knowledge to Colorado, Montana, and Dakota Territory. Implementations varied based on local conditions, but core principles remained consistent. Build with the earth rather than on it. Use natural materials' inherent properties. Prioritize thermal mass and drainage over construction speed. Bronwyn lived to 73, dying peacefully in October 1891 in the chamber she had excavated 40 years earlier. She was buried next to Owen on the hillside overlooking Sweetwater Creek. The shelter remained occupied through generations. Gwyneth's daughter moved in, then her granddaughter. The structure required minimal maintenance over decades. The earthen walls and arched ceiling stood as solid in 1920 as in 1851. Every winter, when temperatures dropped and wind howled across Wyoming plains, the shelter maintained constant warmth, protecting new generations the same way it had protected Bronwyn through that first terrible blizzard. The story became part of local history, told with varying accuracy. But the most important legacy wasn't stories. It was knowledge itself, the understanding that shelter could be found by moving into the earth's constant embrace. That wisdom, passed from a Welsh coal miner to his daughter, then to frontier settlers, then across territories, saved uncounted lives. The earth remembers what history forgets, holding in silent depths the proof that intelligence and determination accomplish what tradition declares impossible.